I'd really like to, I'm honored to be here with the Memorial and Veterans Day Association of Morristown and Morris Township, and thank you for inviting me to speak, and particularly thank you, Mr. Kavanaugh and Mr. Ramon. I just want to add to World War I, my husband's grandfather, Michael Goodman, was a young pharmacist assistant in Boston. He was drafted and he served the 77th Rainbow Division in France as a medic. Michael Goodman survived the war, but he came home and he died as a very young man from lung disease, from the gas poisonings of killing fields in France. Medics had to run into the bomb craters and run into the front lines to get their deputies, and he paid the ultimate price, just like millions of other people. It's wonderful that we're acknowledging the sacrifices of World War I today. It's in the program, but I also really would like to honor my husband, Michael Norman. He served 28 combat operations as a radio man with the Marine Corps 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, 1968 in Vietnam. We didn't acknowledge that for a long time, but now I make sure I do every time I go out. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge my 96-year-old mother, Dorothy Riley Dempsey, who was a boatswain's mate, first class, United States Coast Guard, World War II. She served in Boston, and her role was to free a man to fight, which was very common for women in the mid-20th century. Now, Mr. Kavanaugh and Mr. Romano asked me to speak about women in the military. Now, I could teach an entire college course on that. And if you wanted to pull up a desk, I could give you lots of information about them. But considering the important events today and the temperature, I'm going to keep it short. The best way, I thought, to talk to you about women in the military is to tell you a brief story of one group of military women in World War II. They were ordinary women, but just as we all know from our veterans, most often ordinary Americans can step up and do extraordinary things when they're asked. These were 99 Army and Navy nurses who volunteered for service in Manila in the Philippines before World War II. Manila was the pearl of the Orient, and it was a choice spot for people going overseas. The nurses fought to get over there, and as one of them said, she said, I really wanted an adventure. And then at the end she said, and boy, did I get more than I planned for. To be a woman and a nurse in Manila before the war, you needed 3 pieces of clothing. You needed a bathing suit because it was hot. You needed your white nurse's uniform so you could work. And then when the sun went down, you needed a ball gown so you could go dance at the Army and Navy Club. It was a wonderful life. And even in the fall of 1941, with the Japanese on the march in the Pacific, the Americans in the Philippines were living a good life. Well, on December 8th, it was December 7th in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces attacked the American bases in the Philippines. We were wholly unprepared. We left the Army Air Corps fleet on the ground in Clark Field when the bombers came over and destroyed it. Most of the naval fleet went down at Cavite. And by the end of 24 hours of war in the Philippines, the Japanese controlled the air, the sea, and they were about to make a ground invasion. So these nurses who were leading a good life were on the bases when the bombs fell, and their world changed literally in a moment. They crawled around the ground in their uniforms using their lipstick to write M on the wounded's heads and give them morphine so no one would overdose them. And as the bases got destroyed, everyone came into the city of Manila. And it became very clear by Christmas of '41 we couldn't hold the city, we were causing too many civilian casualties, so we retreated to the jungle peninsula of Bataan and the island fortress of Corregidor, and the nurses went with them. They went from working in hospitals to working literally in jungle hospitals, where they learned not to cut the overhead so the Japanese pilots couldn't see them. Their work days went from 4 hours to sunup to sunset. It was a 99-day battle. The Japanese had landed an invasion force. They were on the top of the peninsula, and they were going to push us off. We didn't retreat with enough medicine, so very quickly malaria became epidemic among the troops. And more as important, we didn't retreat with enough food. So the troops were hungry. They were starting to show signs of malnutrition. And the nurses went right on with them with the malaria and everything that happened. I would often talk to them, and I said, what was it like? And they said, we were glad to work the 12-hour shifts in the jungle. They said because the hard labor put our mental speculation to rest. There was no word that they could send home to America, unlike today. It's hard to imagine. Their parents didn't know if they were alive or dead. And they said they kept waiting for help to come from the Pearl Harbor. MacArthur told them help was on the way, and it was never coming. After 99 days, the peninsula surrendered. It was 76,000 Filipino and American troops. It is the largest surrender in American history. Now, the nurses were able to get off the peninsula through a story that could take a few hours to tell you. They did. They were sent to the island fortress of Corregidor. They did not take part in the infamous Bataan Death March, which I just want to mention was the first major atrocity of Americans in the war. It was a 66 forced march of hungry and sick troops, and if you needed water or fell out, you were murdered. It was something that still stands in medical history military history as one of the awful atrocities. Once the nurses got to Corregidor, this was now April of 1942, they kept living on the rumors, but slowly they began to realize that it wasn't going to happen. And on May 6, 1942, all of the forces in the Philippines surrendered, and along with them, 77 American women. Now, they had a chance to get out, 20 of them, before the surrender. And there was one nurse that General Wainwright wanted out because she felt she'd done so well, and she refused the order. She said she would not leave her patients. She would stay behind. And at the end of the war, General Wainwright called that one of the most courageous acts he'd seen. Well, there was no rules for women being prisoners of war. These women never went to survival training. They never even had basic training. They often said to me, we didn't even have calisthenics. But as they surrendered to the Japanese, they decided to use their common sense. They had homemade uniforms, and they decided to wear their Red Cross armbands. The Japanese didn't know what to do with them either. There were no women in the Japanese military. So what they did is they shipped them all back to Manila, and they went into a civilian prison camp called Santo Tomas internment camp. Now convert just the men who went into the horrific military camps. Just to give you a little statistic, if you became a POW in Europe of the Nazis, you had a 3% mortality rate. In the Philippines, 40% mortality rate. That's pretty significant. Well, the nurses got into this prison camp, and they had strong leaders. And these are not leaders that we think touchy-feely or making sure you were doing okay. These were tough women, and they needed that at the time. They set up a hospital in the prison camp. There were 3,000 civilian prisoners, everyone from Spanish-American war vets to newborns, and they worked with the interned physicians. They really, also they kept together. And Americans often show great, they can get by, they can adapt to what's going on. And two quick stories from the nurses. When the Navy nurses surrendered to the Japanese, they knew they were going to take their medicines, and they didn't want to give up their quinine because of the malaria. So these nurses decided to mislabel everything, and they took adhesive tape and they put it on the medicines, and they labeled quinine sodium bicarbonate, and they kept the malaria in the Japanese